I was 19 when this happened, still living with my parents in a quiet suburb in Ohio. Our house was one of those standard two-story types, with a detached garage in the backyard and a small patch of woods just beyond the property line. It was around midnight on a Thursday. I remember because I had work early the next day and couldn't sleep. I had just finished brushing my teeth and was heading back to my room when I noticed the motion light in the backyard flick on. Our kitchen has a window that faces the yard, and I glanced out automatically at first. I didn't see anything, just the faint glow over the grass and the edge of the garage, but then I saw it. A shadow in the garage window. We never leave the lights on in there, so whatever it was only visible because of the soft glow from the motion sensor. But I could clearly make out the outline of a man standing behind the dusty glass, perfectly still. At first, I thought maybe it was my dad, but he'd gone to bed hours ago, and nobody else was supposed to be out there. I kept staring, frozen in place. The figure wasn't moving at all, just standing there. It was almost like he was watching the house watching me. A cold, uneasy feeling crept over me, like he already knew I was looking at him. My hand was still resting on the edge of the sink as I slowly reached for my phone in my pocket and stepped back from the window. I turned off the kitchen light, hoping it would make it easier to see outside, but when I looked back, he was gone, just like that. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light or maybe just my imagination, but deep down, I knew. What I had seen, someone was standing in our garage. Quietly, I walked upstairs to wake my dad, trying not to panic. He was groggy, but followed me down with a baseball bat in one hand and his phone already dialing the police. The officers showed up about 15 minutes later. They checked the garage. No signs of forced entry, nothing broken, but when they swept the floor with a flashlight, I saw dust had been disturbed, like someone had been standing there. Worse than that, there was a smudge on the inside of the window, a handprint, long fingers, pressed hard against the glass. The cops didn't do much. They just told us to lock everything up and call again if anything else happened. But later that night, around 2:30 a.m., I heard something outside again, a soft tapping like fingernails. I looked out through the blinds and for a brief second, I saw movement near the edge of the yard. Someone was walking into the woods behind our house. Slowly, like they wanted me to see. We installed cameras the next day, but nothing ever showed up again. I haven't been able to sleep with the blinds open since. I used to live in a rundown apartment complex just outside Philadelphia. I was working the overnight shift at a gas station back then, so my schedule was always flipped sleeping during the day, awake through the night. It wasn't the nicest building. Old radiators, thin walls, and an always flickering hallway light near the stairwell, but the rent was cheap and the utilities were included. So I stuck with it. My unit was on the 3rd floor, 3-band for the first few months. Everything was uneventful, quiet. Most people kept to themselves. I think that's why I noticed it so quickly when the apartment above me 4K started making noise. It began with footsteps, heavy ones pacing slowly back and forth across the floor, usually between 1 and 3 a.m. at first. I figured it was just someone who worked nights like me. I didn't think much of it, but then came the voices. At first, they were low murmurs, almost like a radio playing behind a wall. Then they got louder, more urgent, not exactly intense. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone always made my chest tighten. There was something hostile about it, like someone whispering threats through clenched teeth. One night, it got bad enough that I knocked on the ceiling with a broom handle. The footsteps stopped instantly, the voices too. The silence that followed was so sudden and complete, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I should have left it alone, but the next morning, I asked the landlord about the tenant upstairs. I didn't want to complain, just wanted to know if they worked nights or something. He gave me a strange look. "You mean for C?" he asked. "Yeah." He shook his head. "That unit's been empty since October. Nobody's lived there for months." I kind of laughed, thinking he was messing with me, but he didn't smile. I went back upstairs, still trying to make sense of it. That night, I stayed up late again because I had work, but because I wanted to listen, I sat in the living room with the lights off, waiting. At exactly 1:13 a.m. it started. Footsteps, slow, heavy, directly above me. Then the voices returned, but this time I realized something terrifying. The voices weren't coming from inside for C, they were coming from inside my vents. I moved closer to the wall and knelt by the radiator. The sound was unmistakable. Somian was whispering right behind the metal grate, and it wasn't just one voice. There were two, one deeper, the other softer but quicker, like it was pleading. Then I heard it, my name, clear as day, whispered softly, almost like a warning. "Jake." My blood ran cold. I staggered back and nearly fell trying to stand. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't even close my eyes. The next morning, running on no sleep and full of adrenaline, I marched up to the 4th floor. I needed to see it for myself. I needed proof that no one was up there. I found 4C at the end of the hallway. The door was sealed with a chain lock and a bolt latch. Dust coated the knob. But when I leaned in, I heard something. A dragging sound like furniture being pulled across the floor. Then a single loud thump against the inside of the door. I ran. I didn't even go back to my unit. I grabbed my things, left early for work, and drove around town just to stay away from that place. The next day, I called the landlord and gave notice. Told him I had a family emergency and needed to leave fast. He didn't ask questions. Maybe he already knew. The building is still there. Sometimes I drive by it when I visit the city, and every time I stare at the window of 4C. The curtains are still drawn, but one night I could have sworn I saw a face watching me from behind the glass. Back in 2021, I moved to a new city for work, Baltimore. I'd landed a job as a junior architect at a firm downtown. The hours were demanding and the pay wasn't amazing, so I ended up renting a tiny studio apartment in an old building near the edge of the city. It was the kind of place that had probably been nice in the 1950s. Real wood floors, brick exterior, antique radiators, but now it was worn down. The ceiling paint was cracked. The light fixtures buzzed constantly. And there was a vague smell of mildew in the hallway, no matter how often they claimed to clean. My unit was on the 5th floor. No elevator, just a single, narrow stairwell at the back of the building. That stairwell was the first thing that gave me a weird feeling. It was concrete, windowless, with exposed pipes and a single motion-activated light on each landing that usually flickered for a second before turning on. It always echoed too much. Footsteps, creaks, distant noises. You could never tell if someone was above you or below you at first. I chalked it up to the building's age, but about a month in, I started hearing something strange. It always happened around midnight. I'd be sitting in bed, winding down, when I'd hear footsteps in the stairwell. Not someone climbing or descending, just pacing back and forth on the landing between the 4th and 5th floors. Slow, deliberate steps at first. I thought it was a neighbor, maybe someone making a phone call or sneaking a smoke, but it happened too often, always the same time, always the same pattern. Eventually, It started happening while I was walking the stairs. 2. One night, after working late, I was heading up to my apartment when I heard the footsteps above me. I froze on the 4th floor, landing and waited. Silence. Then, as I stepped up to the 5th floor, I heard a quiet shuffling sound behind me, like someone dragging their foot across the concrete. I spun around, but the landing was empty and it got worse. A few nights later, I left my apartment around 11:45 p.m. to grab something from the corner store. As I opened my door, I instinctively glanced down the hall toward the stairwell. Someone was standing at the top of it. A woman. She was facing the wall, her body half hidden in shadow, wearing what looked like a pale nightgown that hung to her ankles. Her hair was dark, long and tangled. I stared for a few seconds, frozen in place. She didn't move. She didn't react. I said, "Hello." No response. When I took a cautious step forward, she turned slightly, just enough for me to see her face. Her mouth hung open, not like she was about to speak, just open, jaw slack, eyes wide and unfocused. Then the light above her flickered and went out. I ran back inside and locked my door. I didn't leave the apartment again until the next day. I tried, convincing myself I had imagined it, that I was that the shadows were playing tricks on me, until the following night, when someone knocked on my door. It was 12:04 a.m. 3 slow knocks. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and looked at no one. I waited 5 minutes before opening. The door just a crack. The hallway was empty, but on the tile floor, I saw faint, wet footprints, bare feet. One set. They led from the stairwell to my door. That's when I started sleeping with the lights on. The final straw came a few nights later. It was pouring rain, and I got home late. I climbed the stairs quickly, trying not to slip. The motion lights were flickering worse than usual. As I reached the 3rd floor, I thought I heard breathing slow, raspy coming from just below me. I didn't look. I just ran the rest of the way. But when I got to my floor, the light was already on, which meant something had triggered it. Just before I arrived, and there she was, standing at the top of the stairwell again. This time, she was facing me and smiling, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide. Her lips barely moved, but her teeth were visible, far too many teeth. It looked like the skin on her face had been stretched unnaturally. I didn't look any longer. I sprinted down the hall, unlocked. My door was shaking hands, and slammed it shut behind me. The next morning, I started packing. I didn't care about the lease. I didn't care about the lost deposit. I moved out that week and never looked back. I still don't know who or what she was, but sometimes, when I'm climbing the stairs to my new apartment, I still listen, just in case I hear footsteps at midnight, pacing back and forth. I grew up in a tiny farming town in northern Indiana, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and the closest Walmart is a 45-minute drive. Our house was a single-story ranch on a quiet road surrounded by fields, mostly cornfields. We had one neighbor, an older man named Mr. Harlan, who lived directly across the road. His house was nearly identical to ours, same layout, same build, just more worn down. The paint peeled, weeds climbed up the porch steps, and the broken screen door always slammed shut in the wind. When I was a kid, my parents told me not to bother him. They said he kept to himself, not in a mean way, just private. I only ever saw him a few times, usually early in the morning when he was watering plants or feeding a stray cat that lingered around his porch. But there was one thing I could never forget about Mr. Harlan's property. The cornfield behind his house. It was massive, stretched out for what looked like miles, but unlike the other fields in town, no one ever harvested it. No tractors, no workers, no equipment, nothing, and yet, every summer, the corn grew tall, thick, too tall. I remember one year, when I was around 11, my dad half joked that corn's unnatural like it's growing without sunlight. It wasn't wrong, even during cloudy weeks. It flourished, to green, to dense, like it was feeding off something else, still. None of it really bothered me until the night I saw someone standing in the middle of it. It was late July, I was 18. Home from my first year of college, I couldn't sleep, so I stepped outside to get some air. The porch light was off, but the moon was bright enough to light up the field across the road. That's when I noticed it. A figure standing perfectly still, just a few rows into the corn. There was no movement, no flashlight, no tools, just a person standing there, like they were waiting, at first. I thought it might be Mr. Harlan, but the figure was too tall, too broad, and even from that distance, I could feel it watching me. I stepped back inside and locked the door. The next morning, I went across the road. Mr. Harlan was sitting on his porch in his usual spot. I asked him if someone had been in the field the night before. He didn't look at me. He just said, "Don't go near it after dark." Then he stood up and went back inside. That was the only real conversation I ever had with him. A few weeks later, Mr. Harlan disappeared. No warning, no goodbye. His truck stayed parked in the driveway, and one morning the front door was found wide open. The local sheriff came by, looked around, asked a few questions, but nothing came of it. They said he probably just wandered off, but I knew better, because 2 nights before he vanished, I saw that same figure in the cornfield again. Only this time, it wasn't alone. There were 3 of them, standing shoulder to shoulder, barely visible through the rows, just silhouettes, still watching. Something about them felt wrong, like they weren't people, like they didn't belong. That's when the dream started. I'd wake up in a cold sweat with images of the cornfield burned into my mind, rows twisting in impossible directions, whispers coming from somewhere just out of sight, and those figures walking toward me, slow and silent, closer every night. I went back to school a few days later and didn't return home until winter break by then. The field had withered brown, lifeless, but something was different. There were paths in the dirt narrow, spiraling trails that didn't match tractor patterns or wind damage. They looked intentional. I asked my dad if he'd been out there. He just shook his head and said, "We don't go in that field." That was the first and only time he ever acknowledged it. I don't live there anymore. I haven't for years. But a few months ago, I was back in town visiting my parents. I decided to drive past the old house. It was late past midnight, and as I turned onto the road, my headlights swept across the cornfield. Standing just beyond the first row was one of them. Same height, same stillness, same feeling of dread. It didn't move. It didn't need to. I drove straight past and didn't look back. I don't know what's out there. I don't want to know, but something's wrong with that place. Something old, something patient, and I think it's still watching the road, waiting for whoever walks too close. This happened 3 years ago when I was 24. I was driving cross-country to move from Nebraska to Washington State. I had packed all my stuff into my old silver Impala and planned to split the trip into 3 days. Nothing rushed, just me, my music, and the open road. That second night is when things went wrong. I was somewhere in the middle of Idaho, on a narrow state highway with no shoulder and barely any lights. I had been driving since late morning and was getting pretty tired. By the time midnight rolled around, most of the road was dead quiet, no other cars for what felt like hours. I kept thinking I'd find a motel, but I passed to that looked abandoned and one that gave me the creeps just from the parking lot. So I figured I'd just push through another hour or two and sleep in the car if I had to. Then I saw Ita gas station. It sat right off the highway, surrounded by empty fields and distant tree lines. The neon sign above the roof read fuel in big blue block letters. One side of the lot was lit by flickering canopy lights, the other side lost in shadow. There were 2 old pumps and a single car was parked nearby, a black pickup truck with its lights off. I pulled in, more relieved than anything. I still had over half a tank, but I figured I'd top it off, stretch, maybe grab a coffee. As soon as I stepped out of the car, the air felt heavy. I know that sounds vague, but it's the only word that fits, like the whole place was holding its breath. There was no sound, no music, no bugs, no wind, just stillness. I glanced at the black pickup. Its windows were tinted, and there was no sign of movement inside. No driver, weird dot. I walked up to the pump and slid in my card. The screen stayed black for a second longer than it should have, then finally lit up. It took my payment, but the numbers lagged as they counted, like the machine was glitching. I topped off the tank, returned the nozzle, and turned to go inside. The store had a tall glass door with a faded open sign hanging behind it, but no, lights were on inside. The door wasn't locked, though it creaked open when I pulled it. That was the first moment I really thought about leaving. I should have, but I stepped inside. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. The store was dimly lit by a few buzzing fluorescent panels, but the shelves were fully stocked: candy, snacks, water bottles. Everything looked clean, too clean for how empty it felt, like it had been set up for customers, but abandoned for years. And then I heard it, a low shuffling sound from behind the counter. I called out, "Hello," trying to sound casual. No response. I stepped closer, clearing my throat, still nothing. Then I peeked behind the counter and saw a door to the back office. It was slightly ajar. From that room came a dim, pulsing glow, almost like the flicker of a screen. I froze, just staring at the cracked door, and then something happened that I still can't explain. My phone at 40% battery. When I got out of the car, suddenly shut off. No warning, just black dot. Then all the lights in the gas station flickered once and went out. The only light left was the pulsing glow from behind the office door. Then a voice came from behind the counter. It was whispering fast, urgent. I couldn't make out the words. It was to Labat. The tone was desperate, like someone trying to warn me without being heard. My heart started pounding as I backed away. That's when I saw the shadow move in the hallway behind the office. It didn't walk, it slid. It moved unnaturally, like it had no weight. I didn't wait. I ran out the front door, jumped into my car, and hit the lock button hard. The station lights flicked back on behind me like nothing had happened. I looked toward the side lot. The black pickup was gone. I hadn't heard it start. No headlights, no engine, just gone. I peeled out of the station and didn't stop for nearly an hour, pulling into a rest area with working streetlights and a vending machine just to calm down the next morning. I tried to find the gas station on my map app. Nothing. I even backtracked a little on the highway, but it wasn't there, just open road and a barbed wire fence running along the fields. I've told this story before, and most people say I must have been tired, that maybe I dreamt part of it, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt, and I never drive that late at night anymore. You heard the footsteps, you saw the shadows. But the real horror, it's knowing these stories were true. If you enjoy feeling the hairs rise on the back of your neck, if silence after midnight makes you uneasy, then this is just the beginning. Subscribe now and become part of a growing community that dares to listen in the dark. New stories are waiting, and next time it might be yours.